The last time I confronted such a distinguished gathering was when I was chief guest at the NDC, National Defense College. I think it was over 25 years ago. The subject was, what is the national interest? Who defines the national interest? Do elected governments define it? Do whistleblowers define it? Do bureaucrats define it? Actually, today's subject, so well articulated by Pushpinder and introduced by Saurabh, has very similar connotations and ramifications, because the real question that underlies the theme, the future of air power in India, is whether the national interest has been served by the decision makers or the non-decision makers with regard to safeguarding our security, with an essential element of warfare and deterrence, that's our air capabilities. Of course, as I said earlier, Pushpinder and the eminent Mr. Joshi have already set the agenda for this discussion, and I will not waste precious time in repeating what they have said, except for emphasizing that, of course, we are, as the slide showed you, in a bit of a mess. In fact, we're in a hell of a mess, a sorry mess, as far as air striking power and air defense go. Now, let's open this discussion on the broad topic of vision for our skies. Do we have a vision? If so, why not? Or has it just stagnated? The current party line is that the MMCA is the way to go, but has it been managed properly? It was supposed to be a gap plugger, as Pushy said, because of the LCA disaster. I can call it nothing but that. But when the gap plugger is itself delayed, we seem to fill the holes with Sukhois. Well, where do they fit in? Well, we will discuss the LCA and the MMCA as separate topics in later rounds. And let's begin with round one. And may I begin this with Air Chief Marshal S.P. Tyagi. What you will discuss is what the role of air power in India, how is it best fulfilled, what should be the force mix, and can India ever become a credible air power? Sir, I start with you.
Thank you very much. It must be very clearly understood that from 1947 onwards, we went into war almost immediately after independence. And we have got this fixation of boundaries, borders, protect the territory, and we just haven't grown beyond that. I might like to say, when we discuss air power, that we are basically a continental mindset. Everything is land-based, and we just don't tend to realize how much the world has changed. Earlier, it was the land forces who moved forward and the air power followed. It was considered escalatory. If the air power came into business, that means the war has really now moved up. Now the role is actually changed now in many wars, at least the major ones. The air power actually precedes the land forces. Now the question is, when will the land forces, will there be ground troops at all following? So I would like to first say that if we want to see the future of air power, why air power is important, that we need to be clear in our minds which way are we going. Second, if we are only focused on territorial integrity, please understand that the armed forces' role is really not to fight a war and win it. Well, it is definitely one, but actually to avoid the war. You must be strong enough to ensure that there is no war. And for that, so it is not a question of, no, we have got peace, etc. The moment you are weak, somebody will come and kick sand in your face. So if you go historically, what happened in 47, what happened in 62, even 65, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto actually said, now is the time to do it. Otherwise, they'll get too powerful. So it is not a question of, the guns and butter argument should be settled once and for all. May I say that even territory-wise, our problem with territory is in the mountainous regions of Kashmir, and even when we are in, when we look at the Chinese threat, and I'm now confining myself to territory, please understand that mountains eat troops. You cannot launch a major offensive in mountains unless you have enormous number of troops. And we will just have to get out of this continental thinking that if we put thousands of men there, everything is going to be fine. Frankly, there is a need to see the role of air power in mountainous terrain. In fact, air power, to a large extent, does not recognize terrain. And actually, this business of getting more and more and more corps and more divisions needs a relook, because and it is not a question of whether we should have more army, less air force, or vice versa. It's just a question of what is the capability that will give you the kind of results that you're looking for. May I say that both, Pushy has covered this very well. Even when you look at the Chinese Air Force, please understand that opposite you, there are limitations of terrain in Tibet. There are limitations of logistics, there are limitations of operational limitations of the Chinese Air Force in Tibet, and actually we should be able to exploit it. Indeed, the IAF has placed the Sukhoi 30s in the eastern sector. We need to really keep this in mind.
Thank you, sir. If I may, that you have moved into an extremely important area of this, which is actually you're talking about doctrine, and you're also talking about a qualitative approach to this whole thing of air power. I wonder what the Admiral has to say about this.
Well, the very fact that we are talking about the role of air power in the year 2014, I think speaks for itself. The unfortunate fact is that as a state, India has failed to articulate any national aims, objectives, and so on. Every other country puts out a white paper, has a strategic defense review, etc., etc. But we are spending huge, colossal amounts of money without really knowing what it is all about. And this is a good juncture in time, because in 6 days' time, a new budget is going to come out. The vote on account was for 2 lakh crores. The new budget may have 250 lakh crores. It's a huge amount, 41, 42 billion US dollars. But I have serious doubts as to how well that money is going to be spent and how much of national security it will buy for us, because we failed to articulate aims, objectives, national interests, and so on and so forth. And incidentally, out of that budget, 92% is going to go towards committed liability. That means the contracts which we've already signed. So there leaves only 5 or 6 or 7% for modernization as we see it. The other issue is that since the state has failed to do its job, the services are also floundering quite a bit. And I think it becomes obvious, and I'm sorry, I don't want to sound critical, but since we are talking about air power, the guardian of air power in India is the Indian Air Force. So I think if there's going to be any criticism, it'll have to be batted by the Air Force. So the Air Force itself has not, I mean, I speak as a layman, as an Indian citizen who reads the newspapers. I don't know how much clarity there is in our Air Force. Take the MMRCA. If we go by the Air Force's choice of the Rafale, which is $85 million a piece, then buying 126 copies of that aircraft is going to cost 120 lakh crores, which is almost half the budget. Was that a wise decision? At the same time, we are also continuously criticizing our indigenous industry for good reason. But the big question is, for how long are we going to afford buying from abroad? Rafale is $85 million. If you go for the Eurofighter, it's $120 million. I read somewhere that the J-35 is going to be $200 million, which is 1,200 crores an aircraft. So I think we've got to come down to ground and temper our vision and our doctrine, etc., with the fact that anything that we imagine is going to become unaffordable. And we have no choice, absolutely no choice, but to build it in India. So I think we need to come down to hard facts. And
I'm glad, sir, you brought in the cost factor at this point, which will I think, help all of us put on our thinking caps, because we have a specific session for this. But your point is extremely well taken about not the state not having a grand vision at all, and the reason that we are floundering because of that. And I now go to Air Marshal Nirdosh Tyagi for his views.
Now, first comment is on future of air power. From Pak-centric force, we have to grow to a we have to look at our strategic imperatives and look at energy security requirement, trade route security, out-of-area contingencies, and also make sure that there is conventional deterrence in place. So for all these reasons, the force mix for the future has to be different. One comment on 38 Squadron. I think the actual strength is a little lower, just going by the figures stated in the media. It would be closer to 35. A large part of force will also not be available because of upgrade requirements. Mirage 2000, MiG-29, and maybe Jaguars. Certain number will be under upgrade, so the force availability will be even lower. Traditionally, Indian Air Force mix, the inventory was light and medium aircraft. Su-30 was the first heavy aircraft, and initially 190 were to be acquired. Now slowly we contracted 82 more, and the number is to 72 now. And this plus MMRCA plus all of the future inductions will take the mix leaning towards medium and heavy. Now its implication is that your revenue expenditure in operational expenditure will progressively go up. It has already started going up. Your ATF requirement is more today. We consume more fuel for the same flying hours. Now in government budgeting, government is lavish with the capital budget, but very stingy about increase in revenue budget. And in revenue budget, a large part goes towards salaries, which cannot be tempered with. So what remains at times is inadequate to adequately take care of the increase in requirement because of the alteration in force in the mix, and also because rupee has depreciated, the costs have gone up, the ATF is more expensive. So there is a pressure on revenue. And one comment on what Admiral Prakash said about committed liabilities and new schemes. We didn't have any money till 2005. So when the new allocation started from 2005 onwards, there were hardly any committed liabilities. So committed liabilities had to be created by contracting new schemes. And a stage came when the committed liabilities became very high because all that which was contracted was from 2006 onwards only. But committed liabilities also have a finite cycle, which is about 4 to 5 years. And unless you continue to create new schemes, the committed liabilities will cease to exist. So today we are at a point where the funding for new schemes has been low. But this is the time when that should be increased to make sure that about 20% amount is available for new schemes, so that committed liabilities and force modernization is not affected.
Thank you, Tyagi Saab. I see Vinod Mishra looking on with great interest because ultimately everything is boiling down to dollars and cents over here. I'll go to two journalists right now. I'll go to you, Vishal, first. Basically to address, what should be, can India ever become a credible air power?
The Admiral just talked about the lack of articulation of a, national interest or national policy. And, I would sort of go into the very incremental and ad hoc nature of military build-ups and the build-up of military capability. My mind goes back to 2006 when Air Chief Tyagi was in office, and he wrote to the then defense minister complaining that squadron levels were falling to levels below that of the Pakistan Air Forces, and he sounded an alarm. Subsequently, that letter found its way to two channels, CNN IBN, with which I was working with at that point in time, and NDTV. So an alarm was raised, and the government responded very typically by sanctioning 2 additional Sukhoi squadrons. So, in a light-hearted comment at a gathering later, the chief, he quipped, he says, "Thank you very much. I'm going to call one of these squadrons CNN IBN squadron and the other the NDTV squadron." So that is just to sort of, highlight the ad hoc nature of accretions And the MMRC has been called the gap plugger, but I don't know, besides being the backbone, the Su-30 may have become the gap plugger itself. The most typical response whenever the Air Force makes a noise is to sanction 2 more squadrons and make the chief of the day happy. The other issues, of course, are, when you talk about the MMRCA, has the Air Force also contributed to the problem? When I remember when it was first RFI'd in 2004, there were only 4 aircraft in the reckoning. Again, in the Aero India of 2005, I got an opportunity to ask Chief Tyagi the question that is there room for any more aircraft to be considered? And he said a categorical no. This was when Eurofighter Typhoon was making a very strong pitch to be considered. But in a couple of months, lo and behold, some of us was at the Paris Air Show in the June of 2005, and Boeing told us that the FA-18 was also in contention. Soon we knew Typhoon was also in. By the time the RFP was issued, the shortlist had turned around completely. In favor of twin-engined heavier aircraft. Earlier list was 3 single-engine aircraft, the lightish 3-engine aircraft, and only 1 twin-engine, the MiG-29 at that point in time, which wasn't really in contention, as many of us knew. So did the Air Force also allow the market to define its requirement? This is something which they have to address. I've heard air marshals, very responsible people, saying, oh, cost is not a consideration. Now, this lack of cost consciousness, when especially when there's a new government in place and you put a bill of 1,20,000 crores in their face, well, I can tell you costs definitely are considerations. Colonel Ajay Shukla has also sort of written about it earlier, that we also need to question an open-ended acquisition process where there are no timelines, there are no costs fixed, and there is no accountability. We also need to question whether the Ministry of Defense is actually capable and competent to handle such complex acquisitions, whether it has the competence, the mettle, and the integrity to do so. Is there need for another kind of a setup, which works faster and is more credible? But again, everything, when you talk about capabilities, everything would start from a vision. And I had an opportunity to speak with Mr. Jaitley, the new defense minister, the interim defense minister, briefly. He was talking about the budget. I told him that over the last many years during the UPA regime, the defense budget has been consistently below 2% of the GDP, whereas the forces have conveyed a requirement of about pegging it between 2.5 and 3%. So I said that, since defense and security are a big priority for your government as articulated by your leadership, can we see allocations for defense and especially acquisitions in GDP terms? And he said no. He said it cannot be done in GDP terms, and the defense allocation will grow when the budget grows. So pretty much he conveyed that there's going to be no major increase. So these are all sort of these are. I hope these are not random thoughts and they're interconnected, but it'll be nice if we can discuss some of them.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping to your time. NC, yours?
Thank you, sir. The future of air power and whether India can become an air power in the future, both of these questions are directly related to national interests. And taking off from what Vishal Thapa was talking about, I would like to highlight here about the strict timelines that are needed when we do acquisitions for the Air Force. Since the DPP was introduced in 2006, and the Indian acquisition process got into the global tendering system of acquisitions, what we have come to notice is that there have been hurdles put at every stage, particularly in terms of once the selection has happened for any acquisition, there are lobbies that work against that acquisition, particularly from the rival companies that have lost out. And they start putting in frivolous complaints and many times anonymous complaints, which we all know that in the last 10 years that have been taken up very seriously and have been worked on, which have kind of delayed the acquisition process in the country. And there are plenty of examples of the sort, the 197 light utility helicopters which are required for the Siachen operations, or plenty of them. I can, since we have been covering the defense affairs for quite a while now, we have been noticing that this has been the trend in the last few years, or at least in the last decade now. So the primary question is, what do we do in such circumstances? Do we go ahead and stop the acquisition entirely, as we have been doing till date? Or do we allow the acquisition to happen in, to cater to the national interests? Primarily because, specifically with to MMRCA, we should have had the MMRCA now. It can't be delayed any further. It's an open secret. So, or any other acquisition for the MMR, the M777 for that matter, though it is related to the army. We need it now, but what has happened is that all of them have been delayed. There's uncertainty with regard to these acquisitions. So is it good for the national interest? I don't think so. One solution that comes to my mind is that once we have decided that this is a good product that we need to go ahead and acquire it, whatever circumstances that we are in, unless we are sure that the product is not good enough. Even if there are credible complaints against a particular acquisition process, probably that needs to be separated from the acquisition itself and dealt with separately in another forum, and punish people who are involved in those issues.
I think that's very succinctly put. Sir, would you like, is there something you left unsaid, sir?
Yeah, there was just one point I wanted to mention, and that is that going back to 1955, Air Headquarters issued an ASR for a multi-role combat aircraft, which 4 or 5 years later transformed into the HF-24. That's the last time that the Indian Air Force actually took ownership, and of course, unfortunately, we only had 147 HF-24s before the whole thing died out. I think it's time for the Indian Air Force to take ownership of, they need everything. They need a basic trainer, they need a jet trainer, they need a multi-role aircraft, they need a multi-role transport aircraft. It's time they took ownership of all these projects and said, okay, let the Indian aerospace industry get on with it. If you start today, in 30 years you may have a few of these. If you never start, you'll keep importing and then finally end up importing a J-35 at 1,200 crores per aircraft. This issue of Vayu is a priceless issue because it explains everything that is wrong and it also suggests what you should do. Please read this article on the Kaveri engine by Professor Das. He says that if you had taken the Orpheus engine and brought down your QR, say, time between overhauls to 400 hours, reduce the bypass ratio, reduce the compression ratio, make 3 copies of this engine, one 10 kilonewtons, one for 20 kilonewtons and one for 60 kilonewtons. Run them on a test bed for 300, 400, 1,000 hours. You will have 3 sets of engines in 20 years, 30 years. But if you keep criticizing and rejecting every darn thing that comes out of Bangalore, we'll keep running in the same place. And we are doomed if we do that. Full stop.
Any other comments on this first round?
First of all, I don't think there is anything inherently wrong in the 3 chiefs competing for a share of the defense budget. As long as there is a certain set of mutuality of interests and the larger national interests in mind, in every service in the world, every military in the world, the Army, Navy and Air Force compete for funds. Now, what we don't have, unfortunately, is an adjudicator to that competition. So you have an endless competition with no resolution. And the actual allocation of funds each year takes place in a sort of unresolved mode of competition. There is nobody to say, okay, the Army says this, the Navy says this, and the Air Force says this, therefore we will do this in the national interest. We just don't have that. But I just wanted to toss up one thought based on, haven't prepared any remarks, especially for such
No, this is open session anyway.
Formidable gathering of experts.
Air Marshal Matheswaran to respond to you after you finish. I would like you to go next, sir.
But just to knit together the things that were said, you know, Air Marshal Tyagi spoke about rising revenue costs. Admiral Arun Prakash and Vishal Thapar spoke about the cost consciousness that the Air Force has to have. Air Chief Marshal Tyagi spoke about the need for a strategic relook at the very role of air power in this country. And Bipin spoke about the difficulties that we've had experienced in pushing through a lot of contracts. I just want to throw up one thought. Could it be the case that some of the difficulties that the Air Force is facing in pushing through its acquisition programs is because it has boxed itself into a corner on some of these acquisitions? For example, what Vishal spoke about, the contenders for the MMRCA. And now there is this belief, and many Air Force officers have spoken to me individually on this, there is the belief that if we step back from this, we will set ourselves back by 10 more years. Could it be that if the Air Force was told today, your acquisitions will be pushed through on priority, rethink the whole force mix? Would we still go in for the MMRCA? Would we still choose a different set of light fighters? How would we actually do it? I raise this point because
do we have that luxury? Do we have the luxury? I'd like to
I raise this point, Inder, because today we have a new government. We don't have the Antony drag. And if the three chiefs actually go over there and raise these points that we need to relook and rethink some of these things, it will save money for the government, would we actually end up with a different solution or a different direction from the one we're going in?
I think that's very well put.
Basically, I wanted to say that, I take off from what every speaker has been talking about, particularly Admiral Prakash, that lack of articulation of a national security, basically, from which everything flows. If we look at that and also combine all the other comments that have been made, by 2032, you yourself, as you presented, will have a force of 28 combat squadrons, out of which 26 will be heavy. Now, is that the kind of force mix that you're talking about just now, Ajay also? Is that what you want? Is that what you can afford and sustain? And with that kind of a force, actually do what you intend to do, if you know the roles and missions, the way you fight. Now, instead of just generalizing, I wanted to put this thought, food for thought, that we need a severe re-examination of our doctrines and the way we intend to fight the future air battles. And I'm willing to throw, instead of generalizing, I'm willing to throw food for thought on the table to say, do we really need 35 surface-to-air missile squadrons? Is that the way we're going to defend bases, which can be penetrated any time? A Becker Valley in 82 could be, with 22 missile sites in 120-kilometer length. So do we want to waste our resources on those kind of assets, or do we want to go and spend these resources on something else which will actually give us the capability to fight a full battle, a limited battle in mountains and other places with a good mix of high, low, medium, perhaps even different kinds of assets? Just a thought.
With respect to the MMRCA, the RFI was signed and sent out in November 2004 under my signature. And it was, the 4 aircraft in original contention, because that was how it was moved, and a 20-ton limit was put at that point of time. But we are already in the process of revising and removing that. So the RFI went out initially in that context. But the intention of the Air Force, and the Air Force had already taken a decision that this needs to be reviewed and expanded. That process culminated in when Air Chief Marshal Tyagi took over as chief, and that was done somewhere around June in 2005. So the fact or the point that you're raising, that the Air Force didn't have a contention or consideration about cost factors and the 2 entrants were late entrants, etc., is not entirely correct. It was a very well thought out process. Why? Because the first 4 that were involved and in consideration, except for the Gripen, the others were 40-year-old technologies. And you're going to be inducting an aircraft which would come in late first decade of the 2000 originally, and you'd be using it for the next 40 years. And it was not, we raised the question that is it worth looking at 3 of the contenders, F-16, Mirage 2000, the MiG-29, the 40-year-old technologies. And that is the reason which was also accepted by MOD, and they raised the same question. That's how the 20-ton limitation was removed. So this lightweight, medium, and heavy aircraft consideration again needs to be looked at in the context. They are irrelevant today. And that's the argument I put on the file, and it was accepted at that point of time. You cannot categorize the aircraft anymore as light. The categorization can only be differentiated in terms of cost considerations and in terms of usage and quick rotation capabilities. So aircrafts are across the board, available across. The Americans have revived the A-10 when utility is required and seen in that context. So that's a different issue. But we must also keep in mind that aircrafts last generally, originally, which was conceived for about 20, 30 years, now it's 40-year cycle. So most of the squadrons that you said will go past 2025, I'm talking about the Jaguars and the MiG-29s and the Mirage 2000, would have crossed 40 years of life by 2025. You know, this has other implications. Availability, serviceability, and reliability will be huge issues. And these are issues that need to be considered. With respect to MMRC, it should have come and should have been operational by 2008. Now that we've delayed it so long, and we are boxing ourselves into a situation where, again, cost factors will come into the picture, you've got to decide between FGFA and MMRC if you're going to spend $30 billion each on each of the programs, and the country has to take a call. And the reason or the responsibility for this boxing is not with the Air Force, it's with the country as a whole, it's with the entire system as a whole. And that's what you need to look at. Why have you allowed yourself to get boxed in like this? That's an important issue. With respect to the acquisition strategy, and it's very important that Admiral and Mr. George pointed out, the acquisition strategy must be linked to national capability strategy. And the Air Force's warfighting capability or the other two services' warfighting capability, which means your acquisition strategy must look at how ultimately every weapon system that I get is rooted in terms of reliability, maintenance, and product support within the country. What we are doing is our acquisition process is just a global tendering process. It is now that we are looking at, giving priority to buy Indian and buy and make Indian processes. It is too elementary, too preliminary at the moment. We haven't looked at this process for 70 years. Please look at other countries. Even a country like Argentina and Brazil have had a proper acquisition strategy. The processes that have failed in Argentina, Indonesia, are exactly the reasons why we are failing. We need to study that. The processes which have been corrected midway and have become success stories are countries like Brazil and Israel. And that is what we need to copy and emulate. I've just finished a study of the aeronautics sector. We brought out these issues. There is a need for a National Aeronautics Commission, National Aeronautics Strategy. It is not enough to look at just the numbers of squadrons and aircraft of the Air Force. You need to look at the larger issue of national aeronautical and aerospace capability in the country. If that is not there, you can keep buying, you can keep spending money, but that's not going to give you the real strength, that's not going to make you a great power.
I think this wonderful comparative analysis certainly has taken the debate, it's taken a quantum leap into what was very essential. In fact, it completes the cycle that Vishal and that Ajay were talking about. Sir, Tyagi sir, you had something to say.
Mirage 2000 line had closed. So what Vishal said, there was all single engine fighters in contention, and it was actually in RFI, you do not specify the type. You only say that this is what we want. And when you issue RFI, it's not for a specific type, it's for qualitative requirements. So what the vendor wants to offer is left to him. And Mirage 2000 line had closed, and it was well known by then, so the mix was even.
But sir, the Mirage 2000-5, that line closed in 2006, whereas the RFI was issued in 2004. And correct. Obviously, you in acquisition processes across the world, you are mentioning, you seek capabilities at a particular cost. My point is that there's no cost consciousness. Obviously, your requirement and even the capability have escalated. They've moved up, and sure, I mean, a Typhoon or a Rafale category has a higher capability than the others. Which you were considering. And yes, I mean, you may say that this is, you may regard this as affordable, but there's a quantum jump in costs. The point which, the government, the criticism is this, has the Air Force, by over-speccing, has it made it the Air Force's mountain strike corps? You know, that is something, you can't keep on indefinitely and in an open-ended manner say that, no, okay, costs are okay, this is something which we can always afford. Cost is always a factor.
No,
and I don't think that this seems to have been sort of seeped into the acquisition.
I think Admiral Prakash feels very strongly about this. I think we'd like to hear from you again, sir.
No, just a brief comment that I was to a process, 2-year process, during which the IAF tried to push through Mirage 2000. It didn't succeed because the ministry raised various procedural issues. Then, on the back foot, an RFP had to be raised. But what surprises me, since you're the author of that RFP, is that what is the significance of the term medium? Is it weight? Is it performance? Is it range, endurance? A. And B, how did you end up with a bunch of aircraft from single engine to twin engine, from 17 tons to 30 tons? I mean, why did you stand for it? You make up your mind what you want, whether it's performance, whether it's weight. So I think this mess in which we are today has been self-inflicted.
I'll just clarify that part. Okay. It's about operational requirements meeting a certain, spectrum of operational, utility. You had to have a mix of both. Let me, I'm defending that, and I'm defending it very strongly. Okay. So we had to actually bring in this medium multi-role combat. It was originally MRCA, primarily because you had to, although I had said that weight limitation is no more a relevant issue, to categorize aircraft by weight limitations, we had to keep the Su-30 out because otherwise the Su-30 would have come into the competition as well. All right? Or it would have been, and the questions would have been raised, why can't you buy more of the Su-30s? Now, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. Strategically, it's unwise. That's one of the primary reasons. And therefore, you created this medium multi-role combat aircraft, which is 30 tons and below. Okay. So the Su-30s are 34 tons and above, 34 tons category. So the heaviest aircraft in this entire category was the F-18, which is 29 tons. The costliest aircraft was the Eurofighter, as per our estimation at that point of time. The cheapest aircraft was, and the lightest aircraft was the Gripen. So the lightest, the F-16 would have been the cheapest. But the point is, you had the original contenders who were there in the fray. You couldn't have removed it because that process had started off. But you had the new technologies, 4.5 generation aircraft, and you also had a spectrum of cost differentials from one end, I would say averaging at about $40 million to almost $100 million, $85 million as the
if I may, because we have to move on. The next round is going to be on the challenge of the neighbors.